Welcome to the Peacebuilding Practitioner, a resource page and podcast for people working on conflict, on peacebuilding and on social justice issues. My name is Björn Eser and I'm the founder of and shaker and maker behind the Peacebuilding Practitioner. And today you're listening to the first episode of Season 2 of the Peacebuilding Practitioners podcast. In Season 2, we're focusing on conflict-sensitive journalism. As this is not my field of expertise, I'm very happy to welcome Antonia Koop. Antonia can draw on years of first-hand experience in journalism as well as in conflict transformation and peacebuilding work. Some of you might know her from her work with PecoJohn. That's the Peace and Conflict Journalism Network, an organization she set up in the early to mid-2000s. But enough from my side, Antonia can tell you in her own words. So, welcome Antonia.
I started my career as a journalist. A large part of my work involved working in conflict areas, mainly in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. So naturally, I looked at the challenges of reporting conflict from the perspective of a journalist. Working with friends in the field of conflict transformation and peacebuilding, I realized their view on the role of journalists in conflict was very different from mine. We all wanted the same. We wanted less violence, conflict solved constructively. But when it came to the role of journalists, the role journalists were supposed to play in this, we totally clashed. Peacebuilders often expect journalists to fall in line with their peacebuilding advocacy. However, for a journalist, taking on any advocacy is the death of independent, credible reporting, regardless how valuable the cause. I've spent more than a decade working with journalists and peacebuilding practitioners. And this particular issue, this friction, has always been a major reason for discussion. Ultimately, we have managed to untangle this riddle and untangle the complicated relationship between peacebuilding practitioners and the media. Journalists can have huge impact on conflicts. Their reporting really affects the narratives and really affects the understanding of what is going on. And the media can be a powerful catalyst for peacebuilding. But only if the boundaries of journalism remain intact. And this is why understanding the power as well as the constraints of journalists in conflict is critical for anyone involved in peacebuilding. And that's what we'll talk about in this podcast. What peacebuilding practitioners need to know when working with journalists. Once we believed that wars were the turf of combatants. Civilians were victims, or occasionally were required as medics who fixed up those who suffered its violent impact. Peace workers were the people who tried to sort out the conflicts behind the wars, and journalists were the impartial chronics whose job was to document the facts as objectively and accurately as possible. But then it all got muddled. Today we know the lines between combatants and civilians are often blurred. Peace workers find themselves in an ethical dilemma about whose version of peace to facilitate and how much idealism to sacrifice for the sake of small progress. And the journalists? There has been a significant amount of research conducted into the role of journalists in conflict, and the findings were unpleasant. In conflict, objective reporting is nearly impossible to achieve. Instead, despite best efforts to the contrary, the media is often instrumental in escalating the situation, and the way journalists report is adding fuel to the fire. Journalists are often powerful players in conflicts, able to shift public opinion towards or away from individuals, groups, or a particular agenda. That is why so many journalists are bribed, threatened, or even killed. And it is also why journalists have become an increasingly interesting target group for peacebuilding programs. As partners, PR and communication channel, or as target group for trainings on peace journalism or conflict-sensitive journalism. There's nothing wrong with peacebuilding initiatives engaging with the media, provided, of course, a project or program can handle publicity and doesn't require confidentiality. However, working with journalists, and especially training journalists, means having to accept a particular set of constraints that organizations don't face with other partners. Throughout this podcast, I will explore the complicated relationship between journalism and peacebuilding, with the aim to create better understanding of the matter, and in the hope to facilitate a collaboration between journalists and peacebuilding practitioners that is true to their respective unique roles in society, and doesn't require either to sacrifice their ethical and professional integrity. Conflict-sensitive journalism, peace journalism, and the bandwagon blur, sorting out the alphabet soup of journalism in conflict. It was the peace researcher Johan Galtung, better known for his theory and framework on violence, who suggested that journalists, to avoid promoting war, have to make the choice to actively promote peace. This idea became known as peace journalism. While for a peace advocate this may sound like a good idea, for a journalist this demand was plainly wrong, as it contradicted the most fundamental principles and ethics of the journalism profession. Journalism is founded on the idea that the job of a journalist is to report the truth, so that all members of society can make informed choices. A role that places journalists at the heart of democracy. To be able to do their job, journalists must not be biased. Instead, they have to be objective and report the facts. They cannot promote any particular agenda, since doing so would mean using their credibility and influence to shape public opinion, and thereby limit people's understanding and ultimately freedom of choice. With this in mind, many journalists simply rejected the idea of peace journalism as another attempt of abusing their profession for advocacy and propaganda. Peace researchers and practitioners, however, raised a valid question. If journalists were objective, their reporting should not contribute to the escalation of conflict. Analysis of media reporting showed, however, that in countless conflicts, media coverage had significant influence on the course of events, often fanning the flames. Therefore, it seemed, the only way forward was that journalists had to accept that they were not objective observers, and had to choose which side they were on, the war-promoting side or the side that promoted peace. Now, this question presented journalists with a dilemma: how to remain true to the nature of journalism while avoiding the negative impact of their coverage on conflict. Their attempt to reconcile the two ideas led to the birth of conflict-sensitive journalism. In recent years, the concept of conflict-sensitive journalism and peace journalism have become more widely acknowledged, and new terms have appeared, such as conflict reporting, peace and conflict reporting, etc. What in practice hides behind the terms is sometimes hard to say, and many journalists, trainers and peacebuilding practitioners and their organizations wonder how to distinguish all of these new P's and C's in the alphabet soup of journalism. Therefore, here's some guidance. Let's look first at the concept of peace journalism. As mentioned earlier, peace journalism had been first brought up by peace researcher Johan Galtung in a concept called the low road and the high road of conflict reporting. Galtung suggested that the media significantly contributes to the escalation of conflict by the way journalists report. Instead of reporting in a way that promotes war, Galtung challenged journalists to look into stories that highlighted peace-supporting forces and presented news that strengthened efforts for peace. Galtung's scholar Jake Lynch picked up his mentor's concept. Lynch was not a peace researcher like Johan Galtung, but a practicing journalist. He realized that Galtung's demand from journalists to promote peace would not match with the journalist's ideal of objectivity and impartiality. So Jake Lynch developed the concept of peace journalism in an attempt to make Galtung's high road of reporting more applicable to journalism. But while being closer to a journalistic reasoning, also Jake Lynch, like Johan Galtung, challenged the ideal of objectivity in media reporting, describing it as an unrealistic demand. Peace journalism doesn't argue that journalists should become peace advocates. In one of his earlier publications, Jake Lynch explored how conflict analysis could be used by journalists to explore conflicts and therefore strengthen accuracy in reporting. A very journalistic challenge. However, the basic concept of reporting was still based on Johann Galtung's original table. It opened a dualism between war journalism and peace journalism. War journalism was described as a kind of journalism that was war-promoting, propaganda-prone, and a practice widely used by journalists to report conflict and war. Peace journalism, on the opposite side, was described as the new and better approach that promoted peace. Although not explicitly naming it, Jake Lynch seemed to argue that since objectivity is an illusion, journalists can't avoid being partial. The only choice they have is to choose which side to align themselves with. Consequently, journalists should take the side of peace instead of promoting any respective party, or worse, promoting war itself. Among media practitioners, the idea of peace journalism was not welcomed. Many journalists were struggling with providing high-quality reporting of conflict, crisis, and war. But peace journalism seemed moralistic, and it felt a lot like unnecessary additional ethical baggage. To most journalists, peace journalism suspiciously looks like an attempt to make journalists peace advocates. And this is an idea that neither fits the journalists' culture nor their concept of themselves. And worse, it did, as stated earlier, contradict the very foundations of journalism, the value of objectivity and impartial and unbiased reporting. Now, when I talk about the culture of journalists, don't get me wrong. Yes, I know, journalists can come across as quite rough and adventurous, and we can be quite obnoxious and annoying. But at the end of the day, most journalists are driven by a deep sense of mission and by a commitment to society, a commitment to democracy that we are taking very seriously. Ultimately, our goals, our values are not so different from the values and goals of peacebuilding practitioners. So why do journalists so vehemently object to peace journalism as a concept? Well, peace journalism seems to argue you can't be impartial. You always engage with an advocacy. So better choose the good one, the one for peace, than becoming a force for war. And that just isn't journalism. We are all familiar with this dualistic idea, the if you're not with us, you're against us idea. And peace journalism also leverages this argument. If you're not with the peace journalism agenda, you're promoting war. This perception found itself reflected in research conducted under the banner of peace journalism. Several papers presented in a panel on peace journalism at a researchers' conference in fact asked how to train journalists as peace advocates. Not a helpful move to make the concept more interesting and digestible for mainstream journalists. Finally, Jake Lynch, the main proponent of peace journalism, accepted a position as head of conflict studies at the University of Sydney and thereby lost his alliance with the journalists who now saw him mainly as a peace researcher. So all of this has not really helped in making peace journalism a viable option for a passionate and practicing journalist. In my personal opinion, there's a lot of great thinking that has gone into the development of peace journalism as a concept. But when we look at that dualistic argument, the if you're not with us, you're against us argument, then that is where peace journalism is shooting itself in the foot. One of the key tools of peace journalism describes the need for journalists to go beyond framing conflict as a tug of war, in which two parties compete for the win and outcomes are restricted to what we call a zero-sum game. Now, peace journalism argues based on the very same dualism when contrasting war journalism, the bad war-promoting type, and peace journalism, the good peace-promoting type. So basically, it does exactly what it tells us as journalists to avoid. Now we've got a feel for peace journalism as a concept and framework. Let's talk about the idea of quality in crisis and conflict reporting. Even though many journalists did not take to peace journalism as a concept, they were acutely aware of the limitations and difficulties of objectivity and the potential negative side effects of their conflict reporting. Therefore, journalists decided to take a closer look at the peace journalism concepts to see if they could be reconciled with or adapted to the rules of journalism. One of these journalists was Nadine Birke, a German journalist. She used the framework of Galtung's peace journalism to develop a model for quality and conflict reporting. Like Nadine Birke, also I myself was one of those journalists who didn't just disregard the concept but felt quite intrigued. After several years covering conflicts in the Middle East, I had moved to the Philippines. There I began discussing the peace journalism idea and its limitations with fellow journalists. We were all critical about the perceived advocacy and one-sidedness of peace journalism, but still intrigued with the underlying concepts. Inspired by several months of heated arguments, we decided to develop our own training program. We named it Peace and Conflict Journalism Training to signal to the journalists that reporting on conflict required journalists to look at the entire picture involving the peace and conflict dynamics, not just the visible violence media often focuses on. The work I did in cooperation with Lateral and Manriquez and numerous journalists in the Philippines, Germany, Indonesia, and later across Asia gave birth to PECOJON, the Peace and Conflict Journalism Network, which today is one of the driving forces behind mainstreaming conflict-sensitive journalism. So where are we today? Well, today we're facing the bandwagon effect that blurs all clarity again. When a concept or project becomes successful, it usually gets copied. The effort invested by all these actors to improve the conflict reporting of mainstream media, under the terms peace journalism, conflict-sensitive journalism, and peace and conflict journalism, was showing impact. The concept began raising the interest of donor agencies. With funding becoming available, more and more major media development agencies proposed projects on PJ and CSJ with trainers who often had little more but the book of Jake Lynch on peace journalism to work with. Trainers who fully understand the concepts are still the exception, and the often well-intended half-knowledge that was presented in trainings undermined precise conceptual work. Consequently, the concepts got blurred again. There were many more different terms created, but not with the aim to distinguish between conceptual frameworks or approaches, but to define turfs and differentiation between agencies keen to strengthen their fundraising. The results were trainings under the titles conflict reporting, peace reporting, conflict-sensitive reporting, ethical journalism, analytical journalism, and many more. Many of these build conceptually on the book published by Jake Lynch called Peace Journalism in 2006, which provides a guide to peace journalism and materials useful for trainings, or they were built on Ross Howard's conflict-sensitive journalism. However, a book doesn't replace an experienced and well-educated trainer. Several publications followed from various organizations, conferences, and projects. Many of these failed to acknowledge the crucial distinction between conflict-sensitive journalism, peace journalism, and those initiatives that in fact attempt to make journalists instruments of propaganda. An assessment about which project does comply with the original concepts and holds up journalism standards instead of undermining them has become increasingly difficult. Let's sum this up and decide what to do with it. To counter the likely increasing confusion, let me sum up the key facts once more. First, peace journalism and conflict-sensitive journalism root in the same conceptual frameworks and use largely the same techniques. The difference is that peace journalism has yet to overcome its built-in advocacy to be relevant and credible to journalism, while CSJ, conflict-sensitive journalism, already emphasizes that journalists must not adapt any kind of advocacy, also not one for peace. Instead, conflict-sensitive journalism argues that high-quality journalism in itself provides important services that strengthen the peace-supporting forces in society. Furthermore, adapting an advocacy actually undermines the ability of journalism to fulfill its role in society and achieve its peace-supporting quality. Number 2. Peace journalism draws its guidance from analysis of the impact of journalism reporting on conflicts and from the goal not to become a war-promoting force. It points to journalism impact and resulting responsibility and presents itself as an ethical framework. Hence, the concept has its rationale rooted in the peace movement. Conflict-sensitive journalism in the PECOJON framework draws its rationale directly from the role of journalism in a democratic society. a refined model of the journalistic task called the discursive journalism model, and a refined concept of quality in crisis and war reporting. It is thereby genuinely journalistic. I know all this is a little theoretical, but I believe it is important to understand if you or your organization contemplate engaging with the media beyond the occasional press release. It is essential for anyone working directly with journalists and has significant implications for the design and delivery of training programs. In our next podcast, I will leave the realm of the abstract underlying theories and take a closer look at conflict-sensitive journalism in action. How does it work? What does it require? And how to explain and train it. Thanks for listening.
So much for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of the future episodes. And I would really appreciate if you leave me a rating on iTunes, on Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more about the Peacebuilding Practitioner, head over to my webpage. That's www.thepeacebuildingpractitioner.org, where you find plenty of articles from practitioners for practitioners. And if you want to dive even deeper into this field of work, join us for one of our online courses. If you want to learn more about that, just get in contact with me. You find the contact details in the show notes or on my webpage.